Right. President of the BMM, Jimmy Mani, the board and staff of the Black Management Forum, delegates, dignitaries, the media, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed. Welcome to the second day of our conference, annual conference of the Black Management Forum, with the theme, the impact of political leadership transition on the economic landscape. Now this morning, as we refocus our thoughts on what we discussed yesterday and what we deliberated, and also to get into gear for today, you will notice that the morning session covers leadership in Africa, and our facilitator, those who were here early yesterday, you'll realize that we had swapped, given Kari with Nkuhlu, so we'll be led by Nkuhlu this morning. I think I just need to say something in pursuit of refocusing ourselves. Try to think about what is happening in the world today. And I'm sure, being in business, the majority of you are thinking about the economic meltdown that is going on, and how will it affect us as a country and a nation, and how it will affect our businesses and the organizations we work in. Now, I'm not suggesting that I know what the answer to that question is, but I think in the context of what we're discussing, it is pertinent that we contextualize even our South African discourse in the context of what's happening in the world. I do hope that today will meet your expectations, and that by the end of the day, you will be able to answer that question for yourselves. Welcome once again, and thank you for all of you for being here. We had to swap a little bit our program today. Prof. Shadrack Gutto is unfortunately about 10 or 15 minutes away, stuck in the traffic, and therefore we decided to change our panelists around. So without any further ado, I hope you are geared up and in the mood to engage in once again. I'd like to call our facilitator, Nkuhlu. Please give him a warm round of applause.
Yeah, I'd like to welcome all of you as well today to this second day of our historic conference. I missed the first day because of certain emergencies I had to sort out, but I hear it was a very vigorous debate. I hope today will be equally vigorous. The topic of this session is it's about leadership in Africa. There is a focus on the impact of NEPAD in advancing the continental economic agenda, Africa and the democracy challenge, and also the lessons learned from the Polokwane ANC conference and prognosis of the 2009 election. Now, our first speaker is Karl Niehaus. Karl Niehaus, many of you will know that he was a theologian. He was also an activist during the pre-94 area. He also was involved in the ANC's negotiations at Kempton Park and so on. And he's had an illustrious career as our ambassador to Holland, and also now he's director of MNC Investment Holdings. Lately, Karl has written a number of articles in the media about the post-Polokwane environment and what it means for South Africans. Now, just to set the tone of this debate, I want to say that what puzzles me in the discourse we've had in the 10 months since Polokwane is that it is clear to everybody that the people voted for change. But if you listen to what is being said by the leadership of the African National Congress, they're saying the policies will not change. Now, at Polokwane, they voted for change, I would argue, because the majority of South Africans feel that they are not participating in the national cake, our economy. So surely that is what should be addressed now. So I think really, I would like, maybe Mr. Niehaus will talk about these issues, is to how can you vote for change and you at the same time say that there will be no change in policies. So is our leadership in South Africa in touch with the challenges that are facing our country? The other disappointment of the current leadership over the last 10 months is that I have never heard a single debate about the future vision of our economy. They seem to be spending so much time discussing almost issues that are entertainment value. And I just think that we should focus on the real debates that are facing our country, and the real debates relate to achieving full employment for all South Africans, achieving transformation of our economy, and achieving faster growth in our economy. Yeah. So I just think that, Carl, maybe you'll introduce us to this topic, and then we'll wait for Professor Nkuhlu as well. Yeah.
Yesterday, while I was preparing some of the speech that I was going to do today, I looked into a little book that I gave to my wife a while ago. It is written by Pablo Neruda and is called The Book of Questions. And there was one question that I immediately found very interesting, especially because it is so intriguing in the way it is phrased. It says, "Which yellow bird fills its nest with lemons?" Now, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to advance that in many instances in this beloved continent of ours, in Africa, and also in the last period, under President Mbeki, we had situations where the nest had been filled with lemons. Why am I saying this? I'm saying it because I want to take you back to the African National Congress Conference in Mafeking in December 1998. That was the conference where President Mandela handed over the baton to Mr. Mbeki. Some of us who have been at that conference, and in fact I sat on the stage as one of the outgoing national executive members, will remember the very long speech that Mr. Mandela made. I can still remember the heat then. It lasted for over 5 hours. But right at the end, Madiba did that very Madiba-like thing. He took his papers, put them aside. He turned to the man who was going to follow in his footsteps, and he said to him, "You know, when one is in the ascendancy, and when that ascendancy is without opposition, as yours is, one can so easily forget that you have to listen to others. One can so easily forget that you have to relate to the collective." And then he said, in very particular Madiba style, "But I know that you won't do that." And in that phrase, he said two things to those who had ears to hear. In one way, he was appealing to President Mbeki's better side. In another way, he was saying that he's concerned that that is exactly what may happen under President Mbeki's leadership. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the 10 years of the Mbeki era brought this country many good things. But I would like to argue that one cannot just talk about the substance of policies. I would argue that the substance of policies are indeed very important. What one does with your macroeconomic policy, how you position yourself on the international stage, the substance of how you state your case and how you make sure that in a globalized and very integrated economic world, South Africa could find its feet, and did under the circumstances particularly well. That is all important. But I would also argue that the style and the manner in which you conduct those policies, the way in which you execute those policies, are absolutely critical. I would argue that the combination of the two makes for success or failure, and will let your own country carry you, or eventually let you fall. On the substance of many policies, I do not believe that President Mbeki could have been faulted. In many ways, he did, and those around him did an excellent job. On the manner, on the style in which this was done, much can be said. And as the process continued, year after year, our country became more and more engaged in a situation where the president was separated from the people, where there was a small clique of people around the president who were executing policy without consultation. I'm not just talking about consultation in general with the country, but also very specifically without acknowledging the internal democratic procedures that are so important and have historically been the central characteristic of the African National Congress. Now, let me return for a moment to that long speech that President Mandela made in Mafeking. It was known that President Mandela had made it known to the National Executive that President Mbeki was not his choice for the presidency. But he also said to the National Executive, and he accepted the rest of the procedures within the African National Congress, that whatever the internal democratic processes of the ANC decides on, he will accept. He acted as a true Democrat. If there was one person with the authority and also the moral authority that Nelson Mandela had at the peak of his leadership in the African National Congress and in South Africa, who could have stopped the election and appointment of Thabo Mbeki as President of South Africa dead in its tracks, it was Madiba. He did not do that. And yet, interestingly enough, when Anthony Sampson was authorized to write the official biography of Mr. Mandela, he presented to him the manuscript. And those of you who have seen the book and have read it knows it's a tome of a book of over 500 pages. Not a single change was suggested by Mr. Mandela except for one. And he wrote in big red letters, where Anthony Sampson had written, Nelson Mandela anointed Thabo Mbeki. Scratch anointed out. He said, Nelson Mandela accepted the election of Thabo Mbeki as president. Now, ladies and gentlemen, here is the crux of the lesson for all of us in this country and for democracy in Africa. Democratic processes do not always deliver the decisions that you and I or anyone within an organization would like to take. We may have very different points of view. We may believe that things have to be organized and done very different. But when democracy speaks, as democracy had spoken at Polokwane, I believe it is part of the intrinsic character of the Freedom Charter. And I very deliberately say the Freedom Charter, because there are now those who go around in our country and who say, oh, the African National Congress at Polokwane and in its subsequent deliberations have moved away from the Freedom Charter. There are now those who try to position themselves as if they are the custodians of the Freedom Charter. Well, well. I haven't heard them complaining about the ANC policies until they lost their positions of power within the ANC. I haven't heard Mbazima Shulua going around saying, I am not accepting the policies of the African National Congress and I am not going to implement them. I haven't heard Mr. Lakota going around saying, no, these policies that I, as chairman of the African National Congress, sometimes hammered through in meetings, not allowing people to speak as they should have allowed them to speak, are now suddenly not the policies that reflect the principles of the Freedom Charter. You see, somehow people's point of view change and they start thinking differently when they lose their positions of privilege and power. Now, in a democracy, this can never be the way that one conducts yourself. If you're unable and incapable of accepting the will of the majority as it's gone through Polokwane in the branches of the ANC, then how on earth must this country accept from you that in future, if you are ever given a position of power, you are not going to abuse it because you can't accept the basic democratic principles? You know, there's another example of people who have been treated horribly in the last 10 years within the ANC. And I'm thinking specifically of the three persons who Mr. Steve Twete on national television called potential traitors and people who were conspiring at bringing an end to the presidency of Mr. Mbeki. Matthew Sposa, Mr. Tokyo Sexwale, those people, together with Mr. Ramaphosa, were vilified. They were subjected to an investigation, but with the greatest dignity. They rejected those allegations, but they stayed within the African National Congress to fight another day. They accepted that in a democratic state and in a democratic party, you know that sometimes you lose and sometimes you win, but you argue your case on the basis of good, solid argument. You organize. And if you organize well enough, you may very well be able to change things again, as happened at Polokwane. Now, Chairman, you made a number of remarks about what happened in the period around Polokwane and afterwards. And you talked about the issue of change. Now, ladies and gentlemen, of course, there was a discussion around change and the need for change on economic policy and other general policies within the ANC. That happens all the time. You know, I've been in the ANC since I was 19 years old. I've never heard a discussion, whether it is in a branch or at a policy conference or at the national conference of the ANC, where policies are not challenged and discussed and thoroughly talked through. If there's one thing that makes me proud of being a member of the African National Congress, it is exactly that tradition. And I want to say today that I believe there has been a very substantial change during the last 10 years. The change that we had seen had not so much been on the substance of economic policy, because we must remember it is critical in times of change that you also maintain stability. And why on earth should we, at this stage, try and come and turn successful macroeconomic policies onto their head just for the sake of doing so? But there had been substantial change in the style, the manner in which things are being done. You know, a lot has been said about the decision of the National Executive of the ANC to recall Mr. Mbeki. But interestingly enough, That discussion, which eventually came to the point of deciding to recall Mr. Mbeki, took 18 hours. It was thoroughly discussed within the decision-making bodies of the organization. And for me, even more interestingly enough, when that process commenced and President Kgalema Motlanthe was elected in Parliament, and he did that first thing that he had to do as president, and that was to appoint a new cabinet. That cabinet had been workshopped. That cabinet had been thoroughly discussed within the ANC. There was, yes, the approach to try and keep as much unity as possible and to maintain stability. But there was also critical positions. For instance, the Ministry of Justice and the Ministry of Health, that the President changed, but only after proper consultation. This was such a change from the way in which we had seen Mr. Mbeki operating. You know, the Mbeki cabinets were always put together somewhere behind closed doors in smoke-filled rooms. It was a big secret. It was eventually almost a kind of imperial decree when the cabinet was announced. And people's lives and political futures were made or destroyed by one man. This is not what Kgalema Motlanthe announced the cabinet after it's been consulted. He made his speech, which was reaching out, which was not arrogant, which was not from a position of intellectual superiority, but reaching out and building bridges. Now, Chairman, that is change. You know, I was at the swearing-in ceremony, and as Mr. Motlanthe came in, our president, and he had been sworn in, the usual group of protocol officers were like, you know, almost soldiers around him. They were going to treat it in the same way that Mr. Mbeki was always treated, keeping the people away. And our president turned to them and said, please, just relax. I want to mingle with the people. A change in style. And I couldn't help but smile to look at those protocol officers going to stand in the corner. Sulk. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we can be very grateful that it was possible at this stage, at this moment, in our history, under the circumstances that we had to face, and the manner in which there had been meddling in the judiciary, the manner in which there had been a mess-up in the Department of Health with regards to HIV/AIDS, all of us, that it was democratically possible for the African National Congress and in general for the Parliament of South Africa to recall Mr. Mbeki and to replace him with a properly elected president within Parliament. Now, you know, I've been amazed by some of the comments that have been made by opposition parties who said, well, you know, we should actually have had a directly elected president, like they have there across the border in Zimbabwe. They don't seem to understand, if we had a directly elected president and not a president elected in Parliament by the democratic elected representatives of the majority party, there was no chance that we could ever, until his term ended, remove Mr. Mbeki. We would have been stuck like the Zimbabweans are stuck with Robert Mugabe. So, Chairman, change had taken place. But what does this mean, not just for South Africa, but for Africa? You know, we can go through the list of leaders on this continent. There are some very good ones. But there are also some of them there that have been there for 30, 35, I don't know how many years. It doesn't seem to be possible to make and create change. It seems that a small group, a clique, can actually, once they gain control of state power, entrench themselves to the point where it is impossible for democratic processes to remove them. Now, don't you think it's a wonderful thing that in this country we have shown a different model? And don't you think it is a wonderful thing, even for investor interest and stability in our country, that we've succeeded to do so without seeing the troops out in the streets and armored vehicles threatening the democratic will of the people? All of this change has taken place within the constitutional and democratic parameters that we have worked and fought and died for in this country. What we should do today, and what we should have done throughout when this was happening, was to celebrate our democratic structures. And to celebrate the fact that a party such as the African National Congress have a grassroots support level and people who are prepared to stand up and to say, enough is enough. Because you know the message that has been conveyed, not just to those who've lost their positions and who are now running around talking about a national convention. I haven't yet, by the way, heard a single policy formulated that sounds any different from the policies of the ANC, so it can only be the policies of resentment that is running about. But isn't it wonderful? Isn't it wonderful that we can celebrate this democratic process, which also delivers a message to the current leadership, both in the ANC and the leadership of government? Make sure that you reflect the will of the people. Make sure that you listen. Don't just think you can talk and quote Shakespeare and Blake at us. Listen. Reflect on what we say, what we think. And make sure that the needs and the demands of the people are actually taken seriously. That is the message. And I think that's the message that the president of the ANC, Mr. Jacob Zuma, heard. Because the last words that he uttered in his speech after he accepted the presidency of the ANC in Polokwane was, "I know that I govern only by the grace of the people. And as I've been placed here, I can be removed." That's a wonderful and clear message to every elected representative in this country. And I believe as time goes on, we will see that the international community will interpret and reinterpret what has happened. And they will come to the conclusion that what has happened in our country in the last couple of months has been extremely positive. They will come to the conclusion that our democratic stability and the stability of our institutions will also find its way through instability of our economic growth. Because one thing that we need to understand, you cannot have stability without understanding the needs of the people. You cannot have stability when there's a massive gap, a chasm between the rich and the poor. You know, even the most ardent expression of the free market principles, and many of them I encountered during the time that I was ambassador in the Netherlands and in Europe in general, would say to you, we are concerned about stability in South Africa because of the huge gap between the rich and poor. I'm saying that deliberately and advisedly, also because today is International Poverty Day. So whatever we do in maintaining most of the economic policies and many other of the good policies in terms of substance that Mr. Mbeki had brought to this country, of course not alone, but as part of a collective, although he often spoke as if he was alone. many of those policies will have to be maintained and kept stable. But we have to also have a sensitivity for what the needs of the majority of poor people are. We have to ask ourselves consistently, how are we going to increase delivery? Where are the bottlenecks? How do we improve the lives of the people of this country, and not just a small group of people who have managed to benefit from black economic empowerment? Because you see, I'm worried that we haven't yet found the formula that truly makes black economic empowerment broad-based black economic empowerment. And if there's a challenge for this government and the government that will follow after the elections next year, it is that challenge. How do we address the issues of broad-based black economic empowerment in a manner that it will indeed create a better life for all? That was in 1994, the slogan that the ANC, in the first democratic elections of our country, approached the people of this country with. I believe that that expression of hope still lives within the hearts and the minds of the majority of people. That's why the representatives of the ANC in Polokwane did what they had to do. That's why we sometimes have some of the upheavals and protests around delivery that we encounter. It is not an attack on the Freedom Charter. It is not an attack on the basic principles of the policies that the ANC has been forwarding. It's an attack on the issues of delivery. Now, I have no doubt that at this juncture in the history of this country of ours, we need a strong and a united, broad-based, well-established and people-sensitive party with a strong majority to lead us and to take the right decisions. That doesn't mean that it has to be undemocratic at all. It has to be democratic. That party, I've got no doubt, ladies and gentlemen, can only, because of its history and the liberation dividend, be the African National Congress. Surely, when Monsieur Lekota got involved in the struggle for change in South Africa, when he eventually ended up on Robben Island as a member of the Black Consciousness Movement and made that progression from the Black Consciousness Movement to the African National Congress, surely at the center of what should have motivated him, as it should have motivated also Sam Shilua and everyone else, the issue of how do we create a better life for the people of this country. You know, the late Harry Gwala once said, there are those who join the party because of commitment, and there are those who join the party out of convenience. It seems to me sad, and it's really sad because Mr. Lekota has got a long history in our liberation struggle, that he is part of the latter, the convenience crowd. I wonder sometimes what one of his mentors on Robben Island, the late Lawrence Bukantlaka, would have said if he sees the manner in which Mr. Lekota is now trying to weaken and divide this party, which, as I've said, has a central role, an essential role, to make sure that there will continue change towards the improvement of the majority of people in our country. I'm sure he will be turning in his grave. Now, ladies and gentlemen, all of us can make choices. That is what democracy is about. And thank God in this country we can make them. So I'm not saying that any of the people who are now talking about a national convention and a new political party should not be allowed to say the things they do. They can create that party. But you know what concerns me is that somewhere around this whole thing is still fluttering and flying. And I come back to Pablo Neruda's comment, that yellow bird. Somewhere there's still all these influences. So let them make their decisions. But you, also as representatives of business and decision makers in this country, also have the democratic right to choose. And if I can make any call, it is a choice. A call for choice. For that organization and structure that can truly and only bring the change that we need. Yes, it can be democratically done, but there is a history. There is a representativeness. There is the one and only African National Congress. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carl, for those thought-provoking words. When you were talking about substance versus style, I was reminded about the current debate that is happening in the United Kingdom about the choice of the election that is coming up. So the people of the United Kingdom are being given a choice between Gordon Brown, who supposedly has substance but is extremely boring, or the David Cameron of the Conservatives, who has style but has no content. Now, in the interest of debate, Carl, I would argue that the substance of the policy dictated the style. Now, what I'm trying to say is that look back to 1996 and look at the type of economy that we had. The macroeconomic indicators, these are facts. The inflation rate was at 7%. The inflation rate today is at 13%. The budget deficit was at 4.5%. The debt to GDP ratio was at 49.5% of GDP. The debt to GDP ratio was far below the current average of the debt that is in the OECD countries and virtually everywhere in the world. So what do you do in 1996? You introduce a macroeconomic policy. The framework of the policy is influenced by a certain framework, which we would call neoliberal, and by definition, such a policy cannot be consulted upon. The policy requires a dictatorial and authoritarian leadership style to implement. So that is what I'm talking about. The substance of the policy dictated the style. Now, the next point, as we set the scene for the next of this debate, is we have to ask ourselves in South Africa, is the policy correct when successful countries throughout the world do only four things? Number one, they develop state capacity. Number two, they invest in infrastructure, which is called physical capital. Thirdly, they invest in human capital. And fourthly, they change the structure of industry, transformation of the industrial structure. Now, the policy that we implemented, remember in 1996, there's relative stability as measured by conventional economic indicators. Then you go on and deliberate destruction of state capacity that we are seeing the results currently today. Let me give an example. Health service, 7 million people increased, the use of the health services increased by 7 million people after apartheid, but you reduce the number of nurses that you're training to 1,500 people a year. And then you reduce the number of health personnel, and then you're surprised when the reduced number of people can't handle the 7 million more people that are in the system. So the second issue is that a successful country invests in infrastructure. The World Bank's Growth and Development Commission report, it said one of the worst ideas that any government can do is to cut infrastructure to balance a budget. Now, we are seeing the consequences of the decisions for the public sector to go on an investment strike. We are seeing it at ESCOM in the state of the infrastructure. We are also seeing some of those decisions around the state of our human capital. Wendy Luhabe has made comments about the state of our education, which we won't repeat here, but we've also seen the decimation of human capital because of the HIV virus. Let us remember, 2.6 million people have died, accumulated AIDS deaths since the epidemic started. And you cannot say that the substance of that policy was right. And finally, we have done very little to transform the structure of our industry. We have increased a few black people in that structure, but we have maintained the apartheid economic structures. So I would say, as I introduce our next speaker, Shadrack Gutto, I would like you to focus on, did the substance of the policy, was it substance or style? Is it just about style, or is it the substance of the policy, or both of them? Our next speaker is Shadrack Gutto. Most of you have seen him on television. He's an eminent commentator on issues relating to the African National Congress. He's a director and chair of the Center for African Renaissance Studies. He's a PhD in economics, and I think you'll enjoy listening to Shadrack Gutto.
Good morning. I will try again. Good morning. That sounds like we are in Africa now. It's good to greet people and to know how they are before you start conversations. But since we don't have a lot of time, and Director of Program, I'd like to start with an apology for having been late for a few minutes. I underestimated the challenge of driving to Santon in the morning. You will excuse me. I was asked to try and address the whole question of lessons that have been learned from the Polokwane ANC conference and the prognosis of the 2009 elections. I would like to maybe do this by dividing my reflection and thoughts around what is likely to happen into 4 parts. The first part will just look at Polokwane itself and see what lessons we learn about what happened in Polokwane. That very intense few days of deliberations. And then I will move on to try and look at what has happened since then in the political landscape in the country. Then thirdly, I will try to focus on the implications of what has happened since Polokwane on South Africa's foreign policy and how that will affect permanently how South Africa will have to negotiate its foreign policy approach, which I will argue has a lot of direct impact on the national economy and the direction that the economy will take. And lastly, I will just have a prognosis on the question around the 2009 elections. Obviously, I start from a perspective, I'm a non-partisan, unlike my brother who has just spoken now. I'm an academic. That does not mean that I'm not politically conscious or do not have political opinion. It just means that I'm speaking from a non-partisan point of view. And I value that position of being non-partisan because I believe it then gives me the room as an academic to analyze things objectively. That is not to say if you are partisan, you don't reflect on things like that. And I think this is important, particularly for me, because I understand was discussed at the weekend, the important weekend, when the National Executive Committee of the ANC was meeting. And what was reported in the press, I don't know what discussion went on, but at least what was reported is that one of the NEC members questioned why I was given citizenship in this country because I'm not a press singer for the new leadership. So if you are not a press singer for the new leadership, then they have to question how you ever became a citizen. So, and that is worrying to me because I'm not an enemy of the new leadership, but I will never be a press singer for anybody at all in my life. Let me start with Polokwane. At Polokwane, I think we witnessed, all of us, a lot of rowdiness and indiscipline of people who are chosen as disciplined cadres of a revolutionary movement and party. Anyone who says that there was no rowdiness and indiscipline would be lying, because these things were captured, and technology nowadays is very good in capturing them. But that is really not the point. The point here is that at that Polokwane, we saw also all sorts of interest gathered at Polokwane from those who command the commanding heights of the economy in the country were present as observers. Foreign delegates who attended were aplenty at Polokwane. But among the delegates also, we saw a disparate mix of which reflects the society we live in, which is a class-based society. Among the delegates, you had emerging black bourgeoisie in good number. You had people from among the grassroots, very poor. Some of them, I believe, may have even borrowed the shoes they used to go there. But also we heard about the attempt to bribe even delegates at the conference. But most disturbingly, people attending who were not properly mandated to attend. So we saw in Polokwane a reflection that the way in which we conduct politics within the ANC is not very different from the way politics is conducted elsewhere in the world. Those same things do happen in other places. So there's no exceptionalism about how things are conducted. But what was important is, despite all of that, the outcome of the elections were accepted, at least as of that time. I'm not talking about the last 2 weeks, what we have seen in the country. But at that time, the outcome of the elections were accepted, and I think people congratulated South Africa for really having a political system and a leadership, under the leadership of a party that could emerge conducting its affairs in a democratic manner. So those are some of the lessons that we learn from Polokwane and so on. But at Polokwane also, seeds of intolerance and disunity were firmly planted at Polokwane. So what we are seeing now is not really a sign of a few crazy people and so on, but we are seeing that there were seeds which were planted there, and I don't think the leadership chosen at Polokwane understood how deep the divisions were, and they did not start managing those differences immediately after Polokwane, and so on. Now, Polokwane also produced two centers of power, which when people went to Polokwane, we were told, no, we don't like 2 centers of power. But Polokwane created 2 centers of power, and we know that that has been part of the problems, partly which led to the removal of President Mbeki, but it didn't solve the question of 2 centers of power, that is Union Building and Lutuli House. Now, what is important here is that 2 centers of power is really under-theorized by those who talk about it. I think it is even under-theorized within the ANC ranks and discussions and so on. And in a multi-party democracy, which is constitutionalized, it is always important to understand that there's going to be a medium of separation between the state and the ruling party. And if that is not understood, it creates a lot of some of the problems that we are facing in the country, indeed. If you think that you are in a one-party state where the party that is in power is also the state and is also government, then you have a lot of problems in how you manage your affairs and so on. And I think that needs some further clarification and so on and so forth. Now, that was Polokwane. Now, after Polokwane, we have seen a number of things happen. We have seen or witnessed the yet unsuccessful grand strategy by the ruling party to try to find an extrajudicial and extra-legal solution to the legal problems that are facing the ANC president. They are not successful yet, but finding these solutions has gone through a lot of circles. We have seen, I belong to the Native Club, for example, and I know within the Native Club, in some of the meetings we have had, there were papers presented to us by those who have been commissioned by the ANC to try to see how the Native Club could be, members of the Native Club could be mobilized to be a part of trying to find this political solution. Of course, at the meeting of the Native Club, some of us said we did not want to become part of finding a political solution, but of course people are free. And indeed within the Native Club, there are those who are working very hard in trying to find this political solution and so on. But also, I think that since Polokwane, the arms deal has been used a lot and misused in many ways. And I think that very little truth seems to be told about the arms deal. I don't know what forum we can create in this country to get the truth. But what I know is it is something which is being misused a lot and so on. Now, since Polokwane also, we have seen provincial meetings of the provincial structures of the African National Congress, the meetings and elections of the ANC Youth League and so on. And what is interesting about them is we have seen the same behaviors that we saw in Polokwane being replicated at provincial levels. And I think it means, therefore, that the lessons learned from Polokwane that I described a while ago seems to be now the culture on how the ruling party members behave when they conduct their affairs and so on. And sometimes it is uncomfortable. Sometimes you hear somebody was knifed, somebody was shot, and so on. Delegates who should not be there. Sometimes, meetings being held in two different places and so on and so forth. But also since Polokwane, there have been light moments. And some of these light moments, of course, is, for example, the Nkuhlu boy has become a man, has and to me, from an African Renaissance point of view, it is an important event. It does indicate that we haven't abandoned all our cultures, because South African blacks have a tendency to try to think that they hang somewhere between being Western and being African. Sometimes they denigrate anything that is of our traditions and cultures and so on. So I was quite pleasantly happy that that happened, having myself gone to the mountains, not in South Africa before. But more seriously, I think that since Polokwane, we have seen the removal of President Mbeki and the installation of a new president. We now have a new president. When people went to Polokwane, we did not have an idea that we are going to have two presidents between Polokwane and the next elections. It has happened. Maybe there are people who knew, but they never shared it with those of us who are ordinary citizens and so on. But I think that that is, to me, important because it happened, and indeed it was bloodless, it was not violent, and it is important historically to see that kind of change taking place without, even though the consequences later on we are witnessing in some of the rifts within the party, but at least the process went well. And here I would like to thank President Mbeki, because he made it possible to do it in a way that was peaceful and less painful than it would have been. It would have been very painful if he had refused not to put in his letter of resignation. Because if he didn't, then he would have had to be removed according to the Constitution, or Parliament would have had to pass a vote of no confidence in the President and the entire Cabinet. If that had happened, we wouldn't be sitting here and talking about, a functioning system and so on. We would still be dealing with the problems and how you solve that and so on. If he was to be removed, that was even more difficult constitutionally. And I'm referring to the Constitution because I think we need to pay great attention to some of the constitutions which the ANC itself led the process of adoption of that Constitution, and it carries a lot of values and principles that the ANC believed in. I hope still believes in to an extent. So it is very, very important. So things would not, let us not assume that the way it happened was the only way it could have happened. It would have been more painful, and we would have been having more serious crisis than what we have, if what we have can be called a crisis and so on. So I think that is something that we need to take note of. Then, since Polokwane also, And this is some of the negatives we have seen, at least within the structures of the ANC, but also the alliance partners, a growing hostility towards some of the constitutional institutions. And it would be unfair for us not to be able to look at this, not because we want to denounce those who perpetrate this type of hostility against constitutional institutions, but with a view to try to correct this and so on. We have seen the sustained attack on the DSO, that is the Scorpions, and of course we have also seen how Parliament has been trying to rush the process of changing things. I hope that our Parliament doesn't become a rubber stamp as we deal with the new leadership within the ANC and so on. But what is important also is to note some of the so-called counter-revolutionary rhetoric which is coming out, which depicts anybody who doesn't press, sing, or do things which suit some of the desires of the leadership within the ANC, being labeled counter-revolutionary. But also the ANC promising to make the country ungovernable through violence if some of the solutions are not found. I don't think that these lends themselves very well to a party that has such a tradition as the ANC. And I think that I hope the party is addressing this. We have seen less of these utterances in the last 2-3 weeks. I think before that, it was the order of the day that you... And then, of course, the ANC, since Polokwane doesn't seem to have any dedicated spokesperson. Everyone seems to be speaking for the ANC. To address the UN General Assembly. That may have even a greater impact because South Africa has been the leader of the African agenda, reform of international institutions, and South Africa has been vying with Nigeria and a few others on really getting the 2 seats that they are fighting for in the UN Security Council and so on. After this event, where the president did not show up when he had to turn back and so on, I'm not sure whether South Africa will have the same level of influence at the UN, or there will be a lot of work to be done to regain that kind of loss and so on. We should take this seriously also and so on. Then, of course, the one which was the most painful was this week, I think. South Africa was going to host the first Africa Union Africa Diaspora Summit of heads of state and government. It had to be cancelled at the last moment and postponed. Very painful that South Africa failed to realize that historic thing, because we have never had a summit of Africa Union with heads of state from countries of Africa diaspora to be able to chart a common reconnection of Africa and people of African descent so that we are much more powerful as we deal with the world, which is very cruel and very hostile to Africa. If we didn't know that, maybe in business you think that the world is kind to Africa, but ordinary people like me know that the world has never been kind to Africa, and Africa needs to reconnect and re-engineer itself so that it is able to demand justice in the world, not to expect that it will be given. So we lost that historic opportunity. One hopes that it is that new leadership can really focus on so that we hold that summit as soon as possible and not. Then there are other things, I think, which one can talk about, but I choose those to illustrate the impact of these changes that we have, which sometimes are not obvious and are not part of our daily dialogue in the country, but which are very, very important. Now, since that we also have seen in the prognosis, let me go to the prognosis. It is a fact, and I think that the speaker before me, Comrade Niehaus, did, focus on questions of analyzing the new, the rebels within the African National Congress, the conventionists, as they call themselves, and so on. So I don't need to go into that. But that is part of the objective results from colloquium. And it is normal in a political system. These are not abnormal things. So let us not treat this as abnormal, these are crazy people and so on. There is political development and change. And I think the sooner the African National Congress realizes that, the more it will talk less about the African National Congress is here to rule until the second coming, I don't know who, and so on. In history, nothing is permanent. In history, nothing is permanent. And I think it is very, very important. And it's unfortunate that even those who are dialectical and historical materialists do not understand that. When it comes to the ANC and so on, they become idealists who then abandon historical analysis and engage in idealist thinking and so on. So what has happened is not something that should worry us very much. The question is, what does it mean for our democracy as we move forward, and are we going to conduct ourselves within constitutional parameters and so on? So to me, that's what is important, and so on. Not that there's a breakaway within the ANC, there's a split within the ANC and so on. It is not the first time, neither will it be the last time. So I think that to me is important. Now, what is clear is that, at least as of today, things may change. Is that we are going to have people moving out of the ANC to form another political party which is going to contest elections next year. So we have an additional political party, which in my view is not going to be a fringe party. It is not going to be the smallest party. We know we have one-person political parties and so on and so forth. So in my analysis of the situation in the country, this is not going to be a one-person political party and so on. In other words, it is going to be one of those significant opposition parties within the country. The ANC is likely to still win the elections, but this is going to eat into some of its voters, but also the new party will also affect the other opposition parties, not only the ANC, but the other opposition parties are busy singing and dancing. They don't realize that it is going to affect them. And that is the nature of politics. Very normal for non-partisan people like me, but probably uncomfortable for those who are very part of it. Now, within that, then, of course, we are dealing with the situation of after the elections next year, the political landscape will change. The behavior of the ANC will begin to change. It may have to seek a few alliances here and there in some provinces in order to maintain its level of leadership in the country and so on. It is not going to be business as usual. So what we have seen since Polokwane is that the political landscape will change. not very dramatically in terms of electoral outcomes and so on, but significant enough to change behavior in terms of how things are done in the country and so on. And to me, that is not necessarily something that we should cry about and so on. Policies, will policies change? I don't know. I don't agree with Carl that there will be major policy changes. I think after Polokwane, the president of the ANC has been traveling the world telling people there will be no policy change. When he speaks to big business in South Africa and so on, he also tells them there will be no change. But when he speaks to ordinary people, of course, the message is different. Now, within that, we also have, within the alliance partnerships, expectations out of Polokwane that policies will change. So we are going to see within the ANC really not great stability of unity and common purpose around change of policy. It is going to still be contested within the ANC. It is not going to be easy just to change or not to change and so on. So there's going to be a struggle about major policies, particularly economic and social policies and so on. But the contestation within the ANC will simply manifest the fact that in South Africa today, those who wield power, the ruling class, the neoliberals who control the capitalist economy in South Africa, exert influence which affects politics of the ANC and of everybody else. And because of that, they are going to be the ones that are going to make sure that there's no major change in policies. So it is not just at the political level. We need to look at what are the social forces within society and how they contest and so on. As an academic, it is very, very important for me to go beyond just looking at political parties and their resolutions at conferences and so on. You look at the context within which those resolutions have to be dealt with in reality. And so that's why I'm saying I don't think there's going to be a major shift in policy. Now, lastly, I think that after the elections, that things may settle down. The anxiety that we have now will settle down a bit after the elections, and that is not bad, and so on. So we must have hope that we are not going through some black hole, and so forth. But during the elections, I would say the Independent Electoral Commission and the law enforcement officials ought to be extra vigilant in putting in place strategies to contain violence. Because if we can see violence in ANC elections by delegates, the violence may be more when now you have people from the ANC fighting each other because they are now certain split. And that is not good for the country, because we may go back to the type of violence we experienced in the 90s, and that will not be good for the country and so on. So I would say that after the elections, of course, the ANC and the leadership in the country, all of us must be able to begin to repair the damage that has been done to South African foreign policy and leadership in the region and the world, because we need it for our own good and for our democracy. Thank you.
But anyway, I would like to introduce Prof. Nkuhlu. He's a past president of the BMF, and he needs no introduction in this forum. What I'd like to say about Professor Nkuhlu is that he's been very involved in the NEPAD process. I understand you've come back to NEPAD to assist again.
Thank you very much for the invitation, for the introduction. I was a little bit late, but sometimes it's said that leaders are never late. They are always delayed. So I was delayed this morning. I was coming from East London. I was in East London to do something that is very dear to me. I was there to meet the final year BCom accounting students of the University of Fort Hare, who are celebrating the work that we have been doing with ABASA at the University of Fort Hare to rebuild that department and get its program accredited. It was extremely pleasing to see the excitement, the celebratory mood of those students, to see how good they feel about the work they've done throughout the year, and how good they feel about the fact that they are going to be joining the ranks of professionals in this country. I felt really good, and I believe that this is some of the initiatives that some of us who are past presidents of BMF should be doing, these initiatives. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the organizers asked me to speak on the impact of NEPAD in advancing the continental economic agenda. Of course, that is NEPAD. So I'm going to stick to that text. And I know that you guys have been participating in more exciting topics about the South African economy, the South African politics, and all that. But I'm grateful for the fact that you saw it fit to set some aside for you as leaders in the country to actually talk about the continent and talk about our connection as South Africa with the continent. And I'll be linking up with the remarks that have just been made by the speaker before me. I start off, of course, by just So I start with that just to say, to give you the background. It's something that I think you all know, the origins of NEPAD is the new African Economic Renaissance Program. It's a component of the African Renaissance, really focused on the economy. This is its origin, approved by the African leaders in July 2001. And of course, the rationale or the reasoning behind it was to deal with the economic meltdown in Africa during the 80s in particular, and also just the situation that was really desperate during the early 90s. Those are the characteristics of the African economy at that time: deepening poverty, extreme external indebtedness, and deepening marginalization from the global economy. And then what was the primary objective then? These technologies beat me. I was told to do one thing and press on the right-hand side. Okay. Takes its time. Anyway, this was the primary objective. The primary objective was to accelerate poverty reduction and to place African countries, both individually and collectively, on a path of sustainable development. I think these are things that you know. But it's important that we situate NEPAD correctly in the context of the Pan-African movement that has been in progress since the 19th century. You know, from Du Bois, Padmore, and later on Kwame Nkrumah, and so on. This program is a component of a number of programs that are aimed at advancing us towards the end state that is desired by our leaders, I hope ourselves, for the continent. That end state is a united, free, democratic, prosperous Africa that is at peace with itself and at peace with the world. That is the compelling vision. That's why we have institutions like the African Union, is that there is this compelling vision that has been passed from generations to generations to unite Africa, to make the African people free, to ensure that democracy is entrenched and human rights respected. They ensure that there is prosperity through integration of our economies, to ensure that the wars that had come to characterize the continent come to an end, and that there is peace inside our country, ethnicity is banished, and that factionalism is banished, there is unity, peace inside our countries, and also Africa is at peace with the rest of the world. That is the compelling Pan-African vision that is really behind these institutions. And if you like, you can link it to the other views of the end of the world theories of Kant, of Hegel, of Karl Marx, and of course later on writers like Fukuyama and so on, who talk about what are these progress, the changes that we see in the world. What is it that we desire as being the preferred state in our countries? Some say it's liberal democracy, but some say that is not enough. It does not deal with issues of justice, it does not deal with the issues of equality. And we believe that this vision of the African continent is good for the continent. But of course, each country has to nuance that in terms of how do you make sure that freedom and democracy is meaningful to all the people. And through the programs of NEPAD, we tried to address all those matters. So here, I'm just going to highlight to you the principles of the NEPAD program, which, of course, I'm not going to deal with them comprehensively. It's things that you know. Through NEPAD, African leaders were saying we're taking ownership and responsibility for the development of this continent and for addressing its challenges, the promotion of advancements of democracy, creation of conducive conditions for self-sustaining development. Here you go. See, I'm challenged here. Yeah, I'm trying to get it back.
Go back.
Okay, possibly please go and listen to me now. Yeah, that's it, the last slide of that one. It's just, those are the principles, but I'm not going to spend time on them. It's things that I've been preaching, as the coordinator of the NEPAD program for the last 6 years, so I'm not going to go through them. But it's just a mission of Africans taking ownership and responsibility for the continent and ending the wars, accelerating regional and continental integration, and transforming our relationship with the international community. Now, the question that is asked here is the impact. So I touched on some of the achievements, progress achieved in the first 5 years of NEPAD. Ladies and gentlemen, this is something that possibly is not, in my view, adequately appreciated by us, even as Africans and scholars, but of course, real scholars who I really do appreciate. I'm certain Professor who spoke before me. The fact that the single contribution of the NEPAD program as the African Economic Renaissance component of the broad Renaissance agenda was the fact that it successfully determined a path or policy framework as well as priorities for Africa's development and successfully defended that path and priorities in Africa and internationally. This was the first time that African leaders had made such an achievement. In the 80s, we had the Lagos Plan, we had the Abuja Plan. They were not successfully defended internationally and accepted to take center stage. There are other differences between the programs, but the Lagos Plan in particular was very ambitious, and I think those who are familiar with it would agree with me. But the question of military governments in Africa during that time and and dictatorship, made it difficult to actually put in the center of that program issues of democracy, human rights, and the things that we're talking about. And of course, the divisions in the world between socialism and capitalism also made that very difficult. Here, because of the benign, conducive international environment, and also dynamics within the African continent arising from the last decade of the 80s, the climate was more conducive to come up with a progressive agenda. So the single success was actually coming with a program, defending it, promoting, defending it in Africa and internationally, and say that Africans have got their right to determine their own growth path through a policy framework as well as their priorities. And in terms of just illustrating what the difference between the NEPAD agenda, priorities, and the frameworks that were dominant at that time, I'm highlighting the fact that the components that we brought in and successfully defended were the ones that I list there: agriculture, cross-border infrastructure, science and technology, and capacity building, and African institutions and regional and continental economic integration. Why am I highlighting those? Recall that because of the economic weaknesses of the African countries in the 80s and of course early 90s, the majority of African countries had just accepted their own inability to do policies, and they had just handed the policy making to the World Bank and the donors. And they had come up with what was very fashionable in the late 90s and early part of this century, that is the poverty reduction strategies, which in our view, when we assess, we said no country in the world has ever managed to achieve economic modernization and meaningful economic progress by simply addressing the narrow priorities of that program within that limited framework. We needed to get back to things that would enable African countries to be productive. So agriculture, that infrastructure, and so on, that's where it comes. To defend that and get consistently placing that message and successfully win the support of significant stakeholders in Africa and internationally was not an easy task, but it was achieved. We ended up with a UN resolution saying that the whole world must use this as a framework for its support to Africa, and the G8 and increase investor interest in African resources and infrastructure. Yes, people can possibly not associate the interest of China and India to the advocacy by African countries. It is associated in my thinking. I believe that we strongly hammered the international community and also strengthened our engagement of the kingdoms of the South in saying that we want to separate ourselves from the dependence on the developed countries, and that we want to pave our own path to development. And that through that advocacy, I think the interest of the countries of the South increased, and we see now Africa change. And then, of course, the increased investment in African resources and infrastructure. We all know about that. The other very important success or progress that I believe that those who engage with regional economic communities would be aware of, is that in the programs of the regional economic communities, the question of identifying, promoting, and mobilizing resources for cross-border infrastructure programs has accelerated. One thing that really always pleases me when I attend NEPAD steering committee meetings is when ECOWAS, when COMESA gives us a report on cross-border initiatives that are being accelerated as a result of NEPAD, and that they are using the NEPAD agenda, the NEPAD priorities to engage and mobilize the private sector and engage more effectively the multilateral institutions. The other very important achievement that, again, I believe that is not evident to people possibly who are not closely associated with the process is that in response to the African economic renaissance through NEPAD, the African Development Bank had to reconsider its priorities completely. It has now adopted a 30-year policy framework in which it has identified and accepted regional economic integration as the priority. All its resources are going to be primarily directed on promoting this infrastructure development, policy reforms, trade and regulatory frameworks that would accelerate the integration of African economies. I hope I don't have to say why it is important for African economies to be integrated, but I'll just leave that. Improved political conflict resolution. You know, during the early part of this century, I would say between 2001 and 2004 in particular, I believe that the African leaders who were really the architects of NEPAD played a very important role in taking ownership and responsibility for ending the wars in Liberia, in Burundi, in the DRC, and telling the world that we as African leaders, through our own structures, the African Union, we are going to take ownership and we are going to make our own resources available to actually deal with these wars. Of course, it's a fact that when they were faced, in my view, with a bigger problem, a bigger country with more influence, in the case of Sudan or Zimbabwe, the response by the leaders, by the African leaders, the architects of NEPAD, was not as strong, as decisive as it was in dealing with these other issues. It's for you then to draw your own conclusions why that leadership was not as strong in dealing with those problems. Now, the African peer review mechanism, for me, is another very important success of the NEPAD program. Again, I'll just indicate with one or two examples why this process is very important. It wasn't just about, about ensuring that the promises that the African leaders were making to the African people and to the world regarding reforms were going to be implemented. And the architects of NEPAD said, the international community, our people and the nation have got reason to doubt our commitment to actually implement these programs. Why? Because the record of African leadership in the past has not been good. So they said, let's introduce the African peer review mechanism, where our progress can be reviewed by independent panel. This process is not perfect, like all other processes. But for me, it was very pleasing when they, on reviewing Kenya, they came up with ethnicity and said, look, you guys in politics address this thing head on as soon as possible without delay. And of course, everybody said, no, things are under control. But in no time, it exploded on their faces. They came to South Africa and dealt with South Africa and said, xenophobia is a threat to this country. But again, they were ignored. It was said that they are being alarmist and all that. What happened? The report, I think it was less than a year after they had submitted it. The thing exploded in our faces. So I'm saying these achievements in terms of these programs are really transformative, and they must not be taken lightly. So that's the progress that has been achieved up to now, and the challenge, this is my last slide, and I'm just going to deal with what I regard as challenges going forward. The challenge of NEPAD, for NEPAD now, is political leadership going forward. I've been associated with the process from the beginning, and it was very exciting to work under leadership, under political leaders who were prepared to lead from the front, challenge their colleagues in Africa on issues of human rights and issues of democracy, challenge the international community in terms of the unfair and equal economic power relations head on, and in that progress, it was very exciting to be part of that process. But of course, African politics are very complex, and over time, around 2004 onwards, I began to notice that the dynamism of the political leadership was not as strong as it was in the earlier years. There were many reasons, and Sudan, of course, was really in the center of the stage now, and there was also Zimbabwe. And things were not as definite. I couldn't go out and tell the stakeholders in Africa and internationally that whenever human rights are threatened, whenever there is threat of genocide, African leaders would not allow that. Sorry, I've tampered with this thing. But of course, I will not go back to it. But so I'm just highlighting the way forward. Sustainability is political leadership is number one. And the leadership, of course, of the NEPAD program, as you all know, it was President Mbeki and President Obasanjo. Of course, President Bouteflika and the President of Senegal. But in terms of the vision that challenges the conduct of African leaders in terms of democracy, human rights, and these progressive ideas, it was Mbeki and President Mbeki and President Obasanjo that really championed and stood for that. Now, what really we didn't quite work out is exactly what will happen when they go. And this is a crisis in which we are now. We found that actually as early as 2004, 2005, I started to worry about this thing. It's really not being a politician, I came with some ideas as to how it should be handled. I thought for me, I would look around and say, Tanzania has got a progressive leader. Rwanda has got a progressive leader. And so why don't we pass on the baton to these other progressive leaders to take over? But of course, not being a president, I could not implement that. So we're sitting now, all dressed up, promise the world, compelling vision, and when people were just getting into the mood, into the process of implementation, political leadership has disappeared. And this is the challenge. Those who are in politics need to apply their minds to this issue. I listened carefully to the role of South Africa, the expected role of South Africa. That is true. There is no way this continent can go forward unless South Africa and Nigeria in particular take the leadership. Why? They have the strongest economies in the continent, and they are not dependent on aid. They have got an additional responsibility in terms of conducting themselves in a way that would ensure sustainability of the socio-economic political transformation of the continent towards the end state. That end state, united, free, democratic, prosperous Africa that is at peace with itself and at peace with the world. That is something that must inform how we conduct ourselves in South Africa. When we decide on how to deal with our politics, party politics and so on, we must bear in mind this huge responsibility that we carry for this continent going forward. It can never be a matter of just differences among ourselves as politicians in this country. If we're not able to sort that out, we are going to continue to be the playing ground of the rest of the world. We're the playing ground of the Europeans and the developed countries in terms of coming here, take our resources on their own terms, and determine what is good for us. The Chinese are going to come and take what they want to take on their own terms. Individual countries, African countries, are too small and weak to stand on their own and stand their ground and say, China, I can only allow you to access my resources under these terms. We can only have that power if we pull our resources together and you have united leadership. That cannot happen unless South Africa understands its role and takes that space in terms of going forward. I believe that I will leave it there because in terms of how we manage our affairs as South Africans, we seem not to be guided by this compelling, bigger vision and see our role in that. And the economic crisis, Africa would be able to handle it differently if we could speed up this question of Africa. That's one issue. And then the two other issues that I just want to highlight. Political leadership is the key. How do we move now, post-Mbeki and Obasanjo era? It's not clear to me. And really, this is a matter that those who care deeply about this country and the continent must apply their minds to and see how we move from here. The building institutions is very, very important. I believe that, yes, you can have leaders with wonderful visions. Really, you must anchor that in sound, capable institutions. For what I'm talking about African institutions. But for South Africa, that refers to institutions of South Africa to underpin democracy. That's critical in terms of doing that. Again, we started this thing under the leadership of the architects of NEPAD, strengthening the institutions of the African Union and strengthening the regional economic community structures and so on. But there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in that area. And again, this cannot happen unless South Africa and Nigeria provide the visionary, committed leadership that is, they are destined, they are really required by their special position in this continent to play. Now, Nigeria, it looks as if this was Obasanjo's dream, vision, because I don't see that committed leadership in Nigeria now that there's been a change of government. What's going to happen here? Going forward, are we going to say all these big things, the pessimism that we're able to break through the visionary leadership of a leader, Mbeki, was committed to African Renaissance, and the breakthroughs that we made internationally and also in terms of strengthening the African institutions, are we going to be reluctant to build on that foundation and own and accept it as our own, as South Africa's contribution to Africa and the world, and proudly claim that is our own and that's the foundation to be? Or is that what we're going to do? This is what we should do. If we're going to do that, the language that we use must be consistent with that agenda. I'm saying that, of course, critical also in addition to the institutions is accelerating regional and continental integration. Here, again, the issue of political leadership in this process and also implementation mechanisms. That's my favorite topic, but I'm not going to address it here. But the issue, the weakness, the reason why we're not making the rapid progress with regional and continental integration project is because we are not paying sufficient attention to the creation of special mechanisms for identifying, planning, and executing cross-country projects. National governments tend to put more attention and focus on their own national projects, and no one takes ownership and leadership of regional. And again, we must do that. In South Africa, we must do that. If we are not prepared to take responsibility for leadership and committed resources to get the INGA to become the generator of leadership for this continent, it will never happen. There are many initiatives like that we should be taking forward. Finally, this question of sustaining political stability and progressive transformation is also a big challenge. African countries, I said, during the 90s, we saw democracy being restored in the majority of African countries. We saw big improvements in macroeconomic management. We saw political parties changing of governments through peaceful elections and so on. But one cannot take this thing as for granted, that it's going to continue. It's something that we must be vigilant and strengthen our institutions, and we be vibrant as professionals in actually making sure that these gains are really sustained. Ladies and gentlemen, I would just want to end by saying that, something possibly that again is not often highly appreciated. It's easy to have stability in a poor country that has got nothing, and there's little transformation that is taking place. It's also very easy to have political stability in a country that is advanced, so its welfare system is able to virtually guarantee the basics to all its people. The challenge is when you break from that bottom and you are moving up. Now society gets divided. There are those who make progress faster than others, and there are those who are making progress, want to entrench themselves there and not care about those who are left behind. And of course, those who get more influence in terms of decision making are those who are making progress, the middle and higher middle class. Managing those processes is very complex and can undermine political stability. We're at that age here, we're staged here in this country, but fortunately we have got on the constitution strong institutions that have been established, relevant institutions. The challenge is to make them strong, those institutions, and capable, and hopefully objective and rational. That will only come if we've got more people who are non-partisan, in charge of those institutions, in terms of taking us forward. I hope through these remarks, I've just managed to just say once more that please, it's not all lost. The African Development Bank, the regional economic communities are implementing the NEPAD programs. The momentum is less than it should be because there's a breakdown in political leadership. So, and again, the issue of our institutions are not as strong as they should be. So really it's for you as professionals and technical people to apply your minds, and see how we can build on this foundation. Because I hope you cannot disagree with me that this is a compelling vision of our forefathers. We must stay loyal to that vision. United, saying united, free, democratic, prosperous Africa that is at peace with itself and at peace with the world. Thank you.
I wish to engage, if I can. I've got a comment or a question for each of the panelists. And how I've approached this is really to try and divorce my own personal viewpoints and rather engage on the subject matter. So this is really about trying to unpack what is being said. I got a sense from the talk, at least by Dr. Niehaus. You have intimated in the sort of throw of the presentation, and I was trying to link it back to your topic at hand. And I noticed you're quite devious in the sense that you do not really address the topic per se. But what I got from what you were saying is that it's an assertion, I guess, in your thesis that the modality in the leadership style of the previous ANC leader, right, at least leadership guided by Thabo Mbeki, presented a growing risk where state power was being arrested. Right? Now the question I have for you is, in your opinion, is that driven by an economic benefit, or is it an ideological view about which way to take the country forward? And the reason I'm asking this is, and I may not be articulating it as well as I should, I believe that the consequence or the driver of why that sort of approach plays out. I'd like you to, I see you frowning because maybe I'm not, let me try that again. So,
Sorry, can you just summarize one question?
I beg your pardon, quick one. All I'm saying is, if because it's about African democracy, if the driver is to arrest economic benefit, right, then it plays out a very different scenario. Whereas if the driver is because within the political party is an ideological view, as you kind of expressed about autocracy and all those things, it then manifests itself in a different way. All right? Okay, so and I'll be very brief with the second one. Professor Gutto, I got a sense from what you were saying. I thought it was interesting when you talk about the tensions between the ruling party and state and how that manifests itself in a multi-party society. It would stand to reason for me, though, that then in your prognosis you would have actually tried to play out, because hypothetically in Africa, I mean in South Africa right now, you have the new leadership that's almost approaching this tension as though it's a one-state government. I mean, political party, right? You understand what I'm saying? I'd love to kind of hear why you maybe excluded that. And then last, if I can, just going to Professor Nkuhlu. I believe in your presentation as you were going through the objectives, it struck me that to have policy, deepening poverty, external indebtedness, and marginalization from the global economy as a priority or as an objective is in itself focusing on the outcomes of a history of a continent that comes out of colonialism. I would argue that what we should be thinking about is how do we locate Africa much more aggressively in the global economy.
Thank you.
Sometimes I'm guilty of a politeness barrier, and I'm going to request that any of the speakers who is going to address the issue be very frank and candid, please. In Africa, our biggest problem is succession planning. To talk about Nigeria, succession planning. And in South Africa, it's succession planning. You go throughout the Zimbabwe, is succession planning. And you go throughout Africa, it's succession planning. How do we bring it to our leadership that they really deal with it honestly? They know that they are not presidents for life. Even when their lives come to an end, they need to be succeeded by better people. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll follow on that because that is a very passionate topic for me. A sign of leadership is what happens after you leave, yes, whether in a coffin or alive.
Thank you.
So, I'm very worried that within Africa, we are talking about the wonderful work we've done with NEPAD, and it's wonderful, Prof. Nkuhlu. However, now the leadership seat is empty. What is wrong with that picture? When we have great brains in this room, when we have the youth and the cadres ready to take the baton, what is it that we have allowed to happen that we must stop so it doesn't happen again? And I'm sure we can do it.
Thank you.
And in South Africa.
Thanks, Chair. Just two questions shortly. Professor Gutto, was it necessary for the president, the former president of the country and that of the ANC, to contest in Polokwane? And what would have been the spillovers of not him contesting in the first place? Secondly, I have a problem, Prof. Gutto, is that the way we tell the truth is very problematic. You said in your own input that the president of the ANC chose the less painful route by agreeing and resigning. And I want to check and challenge you that don't you see that as a demonstration of a disciplined cadre within the movement to say that in light of what the decision has been taken by the leadership, I should therefore take this route? I'm saying this because there is a notion for lay people that the president of the country is elected by them. And while we have not explained it further to say that it's Parliament that elects the president forwarded by the majority party, and it's that party that can remove that.
I'll take the liberty of allowing two more questions and one last round of applauses. Not applause, one last round of answers. People at the back, I need a woman lady. Yeah? Okay, this side. Okay, with the white paper, and then the gentleman there. Sorry.
It's me. Thanks, Chair. To Carl. Sorry, Mr. Carl Niehaus. Don't you think the first thing is the ANC? We've got to accept the failures to the South African population from departing from RDP, the products of the class 96 class, the failures in service delivery, and then in order to assist us to move forward. I think that's, to me, that must be a point of departure, the failures that we've made since we came, the government, ANC came into power. and not wishy-washy over these things, because if we don't collectively, not pinpointing who was the leader then, it's the ANC that was in government, and it must take collective, if it was a collective leadership.
Thank you.
To
Thank you.
Professor Gutto.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
To Professor Gutto, sorry. Prof. Gutto, well, one thing that surprises me is you commented on Judge Nicholson's verdict, but I didn't see your comment on the behavior of the Concord judges on the Judge Slope issue. Their behavior, I didn't see that, and to me, that's a bit worrying as an independent, analyst. I'll leave the others, but I heard for
that's
Prof.
all right.
Thanks.
One last question from the gentleman behind you. I'm glad I took your question because I agree that we need an apology for the things that were done wrong. Yeah.
Okay, Thomas from NRCS. To Prof. Dr. Karl, I thought I've got two quick questions. Secretary General of the ANC yesterday convinced me or tried to indicate that all the woes and the problems that we are dealing with currently were because of personal hatred to one individual, Jacob Zuma. So I think today you persuaded me to think maybe it was not one individual, there were two, that it was also because of personal hatred to our former president, Thabo Mbeki. So can you give me a view of that too? And I think the second question is, when you were also speaking, I'm convinced that the biggest threat to South Africa and our democracy is not Likota and Chilowa and so forth. It is the ANC itself. In the sense that if we believe that we can only get out of power because Jesus Christ will come back. Now, let's see next year. Let's say you win, but without the majority. Then you need coalitions and alliances. So how are you going to govern them? The worst case scenario, you lose. Are you going to be a political opposition party that will still be democratic, or you accept the changes? Because for me, the biggest threat we have is what will happen if the ANC loses the elections? Because now you act as if you have a God-given right.
We get the point, yeah. We get the point. I will take one set of answers. Professor Nkuhlu.
Well, I believe that, in terms of what we can do as professionals ourselves, let's think carefully about the forums, the institutions, think tanks that we can establish to really engage, in the case of South Africa, this new leadership that we have, both the ANC and also if there's a splitter group, on these fundamental issues of leadership. And, we think, as you as leaders, you are familiar with servant leadership and other very profound ideas. I think that's what we lack. And our people, once they get into office, possibly we are, as the public, we're very careless. We always make these people believe that they are God-sent. They are so wise and so exceptional that no one can take over from them. And we are guilty of that, even us as professionals. So really, it's a huge problem. But I believe that in the case of South Africa, we brought this thing to ourselves. We're so close, it was just 6 months away. We could have just waited for 6 months. And when we're talking about, South Africa would have been exemplary in terms of, we ran, there was absolutely no need, really. We could have just waited and really would have been exemplary because in terms of the constitutional structures, we've got them in place. There's nothing to need in terms of the constitution and so on. Yes, I hear people who say that the president must be elected directly by the people. That may be another way of looking at things, but as I say, the question of revisiting leadership and us as professionals playing a role in that, let's really think about that so that really people get to understand those who go into leadership. And we practice in BMF, we practice in other, I don't understand, possibly there are no material rewards BMF. Sorry, that's a very humble comment on that. I've got another question here. What is being done to make the question of passing on the baton that I raised? I hope, colleagues, you are aware of the fact that the Prime Minister of Ethiopia is the chairman of NEPAD, and that has been done. With all due respect, I'm very loyal to African leaders. I was their servant for all these years in NEPAD. But that hasn't me, because it happened just after Ethiopia had very difficult elections that were contested, and many people ended in exile, and some got killed. The role of government was never clear, was never satisfactorily explained to me. So you have that situation, but in answering the question, so for me, much as the leaders have decided on who leads NEPAD, and I believe that we needed a more sophisticated plan. Possibly there is just competition and among African leaders in terms of ideologies, where they come from, that I don't fully understand. Because on the face of it, we've got a number of progressive leaders in Africa. I keep getting back to this president of the African Union now, and a few others. But of course, whatever we do, South Africa and Nigeria must be there. Why? Because you cannot really transform this continent unless you have got economic muscle to make it happen. So really that's fundamental. The question of locating the African economy in the global agenda. So colleague, you misunderstood me. I didn't say that the objective or primary purpose of NEPAD was to end indebtedness and so on. I said that's what characterized Africa at the time. The end, what's called primary objective was sustainable development. Sustainable development means exactly ending much in the global economy and adopting policies that facilitate economic modernization, as well as participation in the global trade situation, but of course not on the terms imposed by the developed countries or the World Bank, but on the terms that you have taken part in creating, and you sequence your development, your reforms in the way that best suits your level of development and the constraints with which you are faced. This is the difference between how we've managed our affairs and how Malaysia manages affairs, and how the other countries that manage to develop being latecomers, is because they have the capacity, both politically as well as technically, to sequence the development in the way that suited them, and they did that. They defended that very successfully.
Thanks, Prof.
The question I want to respond.
I'll start with the question about succession planning. I believe that it should be possible in a political party, if there is an approach by the leaders of that party, and then one can extend that also to the country, to accept that they have, first of all, a limited period that they're there, and secondly, that they work together in order to place people both within the party and on the national stage, that is the leadership of the country, in a way that will be properly dealt with and properly democratically dealt with the people. I think that one of the biggest mistakes that we had seen in the last year, and to some extent we are continuing to see the wind that had been sown and the storm that had been created, was the decision by President Mbeki to stand again as ANC president. A large number of the problems that we had seen in Polokwane and subsequently could have been avoided. It was a wrong decision. And I think one has to say very clearly that it is a sad situation, that it led to the eventual situation where Mr. Mbeki was recalled as president at this stage. I'm sure that the majority of people in the national executive of the ANC will agree that they would have preferred not to have gone that route. I was asked by the moderator to say something about the process that led to that recall. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the discussion that took place in the National Executive of the ANC, contrary to what it seems to be reported on, did not concentrate in the first instance about the judgment of Judge Nicholson. Yes, of course, that came into the discussion. But the discussion was about what was happening in the relationship between the African National Congress and its leadership and the leadership in government during the period since Polokwane up to now. And this was a very serious situation. We were faced with a situation where in that period there was increasing paralysis in government. There was an increasing lack of preparedness to find that engagement by President Mbeki and the cabinet with the national executive of the political party that have placed them there. That is simply democracy. There had to be that interaction. It failed. We were increasingly ending up in a quagmire where hardly any decisions could be taken. Now, it was that whole conversation which took a period, as I said, of 18 hours before finally the decision was taken to remove President Mbeki. Now, this shouldn't happen. We shouldn't be in a situation where this kind of situation develops and where this kind of drastic action needs to be taken. I think all of us agree that this was a damaging process. What I'm happy about is that the process was managed in a way that established stability in the country and that we managed to move ahead. Now, with regards to the question about what happens if the ANC loses or if the ANC loses a considerable part of its majority in the elections of next year. If it happens, and personally I do not believe it is going to happen, but that is my personal point of view. If it happens, I've got no doubt that the ANC will accept the Constitution as it stands. If it loses, again I'm saying, in the unlikely event, if it loses the majority, it will simply step back and become the opposition. If it ends up in a situation where it is necessary, like in many other countries in the world, to work in coalitions in order to get policy through, it will do so. But I repeat what I said in my main contribution. I do not believe that it is in the best interest of our country at this juncture to have a government that has to be in coalition, or to have a government where its majority is substantially weakened. I don't believe that. We need to have a government in South Africa at this stage which can take central role, take important decisions, and can claim with legitimacy that it carries the majority of people to a very large extent with it. That is why I said that I believe in this country at this stage, the African National Congress, as the broad party that it is, needs a substantial majority. And that is why I said, that I believe that the actions of Mr. Lekota and Mr. Shilowa and others is ill-conceived, especially if it comes from the principles that led them to become members in the first instance of the African National Congress. If there are other things that drive them, like personal ambition, like wanting to have power and they've lost it and they now need to hold on to it for dear life, if the things that lead them, let them go. Okay, thanks. But if it's a principle, then I believe that is the place where they should be. Now, with regards to, can I just say one last thing with regards to the issue on style and substance, because there was a question about it. And in fact, the moderator also referred to it. Of course, it is not just an issue of size. And of course, as the process of engagement in a more democratic and collective manner continues, that engagement will impact on the substance of policy. But for us to have expected that in the short period of the last couple of months since Polokwane, for major, substantial policy changes to take place, I think is unrealistic. It is a process. But that process must reflect what is being said on the ground about the lack of delivery and the issues around poverty. And I believe it will. And of course, that will address issues around inflation targeting. It will address a whole myriad of issues around the kind of economic policies that seems to have been accepted so easily in the last years of the Mbeki era. Thank you.
I'm pressed for time, so I think I'll be very brief. I think that firstly, the question of succession, which is the common one, I think that Africa has improved its planning about succession, particularly of the leadership. Increasingly, the new constitutions that we have provide for 2 terms rather than being left open. And that contributes to bringing some certainty about succession, but it is not necessary that every country should just limit themselves to 2 terms, because that is, democracy is not defined in terms of terms and so on. So I think that what is needed really is one of, I would say, an understanding, first of all, that when you leave office, you should leave office not having committed too many crimes as a head of state. But that is where the problem starts, abuse of power while you are in office. And once you abuse power, you don't want to leave. That is very, very important. Secondly, our use of the state as a means of accumulation of wealth. I'm the leader, therefore I use it to accumulate wealth and to make my friends and relatives and cousins and girlfriends and boyfriends accumulate wealth. Then it becomes a problem, because if you leave, they may be pursued, and so you don't want to leave. So there are a lot of reasons. So we need to clean really relationship. What is leadership? What does leadership mean? So we need a new type of leadership, where leadership is really a servant to the people, rather than the mentality that I get into a position of leadership. So I believe that let us address those problems. Another thing about succession is most of our leaders, and that's why we are not developing a lot in Africa. You think when a new leader comes in, they must undo what the other leader did. So they end up damaging even the positive things that have been achieved in a bid to try. And that is problematic, because then every time you start again, you start all over again, and you are going backwards. You are not moving. You are not building on what has already been achieved. So we have a lot to do about leadership and education about leadership on the continent.
Thanks, Prof. Okay, the session is over.